Alright, so this week's lessons are on the primeval history of Genesis chapter 1 through 11, and there are two big stories that we have not yet covered, and that kind of bring us to the end of this time period. The Flood and the Tower of Babel. The overall story of the Bible is that God works to save us, but in order to save humanity, humanity has to first realize that it needs saving, and that's kind of why the flood happens. God lets humanity go on its own for so long that it realizes it's not going anywhere. And all that's really left for humanity is just a giant reset button because we cannot save ourselves. And so, have you ever just wanted to hit reset on life? That's what happened in the flood. Yes, the story of the flood is actually, when you think about it, a very sad story. I know we paint lots of children's classrooms with all the cute animals on the wall, but what happens just a few days after that picture of all the animals walking? Everything else dies. But it's because God let humanity go to the fullest extent when there's only one righteous family left on the entire earth. And as we learn, as we get through the end of the story, he's not even that righteous himself. Now, I realize that this is a long passage, but I'm going to have to ask you to stop and read a long passage right now. I need you to hit pause and read Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through Genesis chapter 9, verse 17 now. Okay, now hopefully you've read it, and I can teach you about Hebrew poetry. See, Hebrew poetry does not rhyme. That's English poetry. I'm sure some other cultures and languages do that too for their way of doing poetry. But Hebrew becomes poetic when it starts repeating itself. And you might have noticed some repetition in the story of Noah as well. In fact, if you divide up the story and put over here in this pile all of the verses or sentences, I guess, that say the word God to talk about God, and then you put them over here, and then you put all the sentences that say the Lord to talk about God, you'll notice that God and the Lord commands kind of repeat themselves, and you get two, not quite independent, but two stories that make sense on their own side by side. They are one story, but there's lots of repetition going on in this story. Basic repetition, though, is not the only form of poetry involved. In this story, you also have what is called a chiasm, or a chiastic structure. See, a chiasm, or chiastic structure, is a literary device, specifically in Hebrew, that focuses the astute reader's attention to one specific phrase by repeating all of the other details. Not just back to back, but first and last, second to penultimate, third to last, fourth to last, and however big the story is. So for example, with the story of the flood, you see Noah and his sons, and Noah and his sons. And even just looking at the numbers, let's just skip the other details and talk about numbers. 7 days of waiting for the flood, 7 days of waiting for the dove to return. 7 days of waiting for the flood, 7 days of waiting for the other dove to return. 40 days for the flood, 40 days for waiting to releasing a bird. 150 days of water coming, 150 days of water waning. And in the middle of that story there, you can even grab other details. Just write them out yourself if you'd like to do this exercise. It's kind of interesting to do. But in the middle of all those details is one single phrase that does not get repeated anywhere else, and that is that God remembered Noah. This means that God remembered Noah is the central and most important phrase, according to the author, for this entire story. God remembers Noah. So what's the most important takeaway from the story of Noah and the flood? It's that God remembers someone. God remembers us even when the world is completely out of hand is a nice, good takeaway from this story. Now, grabbing the context of what we already know about Noah, if you read the verses before the flood story starts, we don't know much about him at all. We know practically nothing about him except that he is a man who is willing to walk with God, and he is righteous even when literally everyone else around him is not. Now, you learn that he is still human with the story that comes right after the flood, but he at least works with God and tries to follow after God, and God remembers him in spite of the literally biggest storm in all of creation. And so that's a great moral message from this story, but it also, not just, hey, God can remember you too, but it pushes the Bible story forward. Remember, the overall story of the Bible is that God is working to save us. God will save us, and he lets us realize we can't save ourselves, and he still provides a way for the lineage of humanity to continue, and there's a righteous line running through it all. And So there's that story. Here's the other final story in the primeval history and introduction to the Bible. That's what the primeval Genesis 1 through 11, 1 through 12 is, and that is the Tower of Babel. This is a much shorter passage, so go ahead and pause here and read just Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. It's just a really short story, so go ahead and do that, please. Now, in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, they make a name for themselves. That's what they seek out to do, is that we want to make a name for ourselves and be the best and coolest and remembered ultimately forever and ever. I don't know if they would have said amen or not. But they also happen to disregard God's law and God's command to spread out through the earth and multiply and subdue it. So it seems that humanity left to its own devices, even after the giant reset button, is that they're still disobedient. And so God provides the ultimate pun. It's that, hey, the town of Babel is now going to be filled with people who babble because they can't understand each other. All of the languages are scattered, and this is where we get different families of languages coming from. And now, this is kind of neat because it's one of the few puns that actually gets to be translated into English. It's fairly hard to translate puns, but in the original languages, they are everywhere throughout the Bible. And so God forces them to disregard their plans, I guess, but God forces them to disperse, and it slows down humanity's cooperative effort to sin more, and so it kind of slows it down enough that God is able to set the stage to start raising up a way for him to save the world. And so that's how this carries forward the story of the Bible. Babylon appearing so early in the Bible is also a nice kind of bookend for the story of the whole Bible, because it starts, the introduction ends at least, so it starts with Babel, and Babel is brought up again, the great city of Babel, a different version of it is brought up again at the very end of the story, when God punishes the great city of Babylon. But today, here's the question though. Are you ever tempted to cave to pressures from when it seems like literally everyone else around you is doing it? Is it refreshing to know that even when the world is crashing around you and there are all of those pressures, that God still remembers the righteous? And do you try to build a name for yourself, or do you try to build a name for God? And what can you do for the rest of this week to trust God that he will remember you? He remembers you, and you don't need to build a name for yourself. And you can attempt to make a name for God instead. How can you do that with what's left of this week? Please answer this in the comments or ask more questions below. Thank you.